Okay, we are in Exodus chapter 16. Start with verse 22, read through the end of the chapter, and talk about that for a little bit. Now on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, then he said to them, "This is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until the morning." So they put it aside until morning, as Moses had ordered, and it did not become foul, nor was there any worm in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none." And it came about on the seventh day that some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath, therefore he gives you bread for 2 days. On the sixth day, remain every man in his place, let no man go out of his place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day. The house of Israel named it manna, and it was like coriander seed, white, and its taste was like wafers with honey. Then Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer full be kept throughout your generations, that they may see the bread that I fed you in the wilderness, when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer full in it, and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations." As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. The sons of Israel are the ate the manna, for 40 years until they came into an inhabited land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Now an omer is a tenth of an ephah. Okay. What do we think about that?
Is this really the first time the Sabbath is explained? Or was it that earlier? I know that off and on they kept, for whatever reason, God rested on the seventh day and made it holy. Did they always keep the Sabbath? Or I'm a little hazy on that.
Well, I think this is like where it becomes part of their culture. It's an expectation
Right.
Of the culture under the Mosaic law. This is as far as whether or not they ever, I'm sure they took a day off every now and then, but you grew up on a farm and you know that it's hard to take a day off on a farm, isn't it? I mean, there's just something, and especially if the pond's froze over, you got to go bust the ice for the cows or something like that. So, yeah, that can wait till Monday. They don't have to drink until Monday. So it's, but yeah, it's, their ancestors called upon the Lord, worshiped the Lord in their own way, whether or not they took a Sabbath, took a day of rest to honor what they understood of the creation story. I don't know, but that's what this ties back to. This ties back to Israel's account of the creation, how the world came to be. And it came with the Lord creating, working in a sense, 6 days, although he's just speaking, it's working. He creates in 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rests. And it is something that, we come to understand more the need to engage and then disengage from our work, that it's really not a healthy life to be consumed by work all the time, at least not for most people. Some people, I guess, are so career-oriented, career-centered that it's harder for them to be away from work than it is for them to be at work. I think for those people, this is an even more important commandment, perhaps. If you have a really hard time not working, if it just bugs you to not work, maybe you're the one who needs this more than anyone else. I mean, ultimately, You know, Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It is supposed to be a blessing. But part of the blessing, it's not so much just that you're not working, it's that you are honoring God with that rest. So, yes, sir.
My man-made footnote says that this is the first occurrence of the word itself.
Okay, that may be. Yeah, so I'm not disputing that.
What the whole comment says this is first occurrence of the word Sabbath itself, though the principle of the seventh day is a day of rest and holiness is set forth in the account of creation. So, anyway.
Well, and when Noah gets off the boat, you could say he keeps the Sabbath. You know, he rests, maybe a little too restful. Gets a little. It has a little too much time on, too much fun on his day off. But you know, it's a day of rest, and yet it's not something you can do just kind of accidentally. You can't wake up in the morning. It's Sabbath. We're not going to do anything today. That's not how you get through the day, at least not very easily, not very well. You have to prepare for it. You have to work for it. A lot of people think about going camping as a vacation, getting away from it all. What happens if you're going to go camping? There's a lot of work, isn't there? And there's a lot of work while you're out there, and it's sometimes really harder work because you don't have all your structures around you and all your appliances and all that. And then you get back from camping, what happens? You got to work. You can't put it up dirty or it'll all be ruined. So this is kind of like that in a sense. It's a Sabbath. It's a rest that you have to really prepare for. It's not restful when you wake up on the Sabbath and there's no food in the house and you got kids and everything else. You got to get through the day without anything to eat. It's not inherent. They did have times of fasting, and that would be nothing, I guess, wrong with fasting on the Sabbath as well. But you know, you can see, I think, in this why they would delineate culturally what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath to such a fine degree. I mean, you have to do something. I mean, if you've cooked and prepared the food, can you not dish it? And do you have to pre-dish it before you eat it? You know, do you have? I mean, at what level can you exert some energy to meet your basic needs? And so it's really an act of devotion, and I don't think it was ever meant to be quite the nitpicking thing that it kind of became in the times of Jesus. But you know, there is a Sabbath day journey. There's a mountain distance you can walk. There are some activities you could do. If your ox falls into a ditch, you can, you know, there's emergency dispensations, and there's even now for an observant Jew, there are reasons to break the Sabbath. There are reasons to work or exert yourself on the Sabbath. But it got to be usually like a matter of life and death or something like that, some very significant emergency in order to do that.
Well, isn't the Sabbath just another example of where man takes God's more simple things and makes them so much more complicated than what God intended them to be?
And yeah, and it's part, I think, presents the challenge of wanting to follow God obediently, because a lot of times the guidelines are very general too. And how does it apply in your daily life? How does it apply in your context? And how would it apply to someone in the 21st century America versus, you know, 1,000 years before Christ? You know, I mean, our cooking, what we do to cook a lot of times, I go over to the freezer and get something out and pop it in the microwave for a few minutes and let it sit for a minute, and, you know, well, there's dinner. You know, that's probably less work than they would do just to eat what they had already prepared on the Sabbath. but it might still be a violation of their application, their customs, because of the using of an appliances, using two appliances and all of that. So it's there's this balancing act of understanding. I think really people don't like this terminology sometimes, but the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. What is the law trying to accomplish? And at the same time, if you ignore the letter, you will eventually get away from the spirit. So there is a time and a place to be. Obviously, with God, at times you need to be very strictly obedient. Minor, what would appear to us to be minor, perhaps even well-intentioned departures from the statute have very severe consequences. And then at other times, God is very gracious. And it's usually when people are doing their best from a broken place, maybe coming from the distance from God. They're not really close to God at the time, and they're trying to make their way back to God. And along that journey, he seems to be more gracious than when they should be right there in step with where they need to be, and they take a little step to the left or the right. This is an integral part of Jewish culture, and it's part of what makes them maybe such a poor slavery people. They're not a good people to enslave, because it's been the ancient world. Because all the cultures in the ancient world really were agrarian, and if you think about it, we know that here in this area, but there's a lot of places in America where they've never seen a farm, basically. They've never been awakened by a rooster in the morning. They've never heard cows, mooing outside their home. I had a roommate my last semester at Harding. I shared a duplex with 3 other guys, and my roommate was from the DC area. I think that's where he was from. And we were outside of Searcy. Searcy's a small town. Searcy's a lot like Walla Walla. And we were outside there about 10 miles. So we were out in the sticks, and anything to save a buck. And the duplex was surrounded by a pasture. And when my roommate moved in, the cows were out there grazing in the pasture. He woke up one morning, looked out there, and the cows were gone. And why aren't they out there? Where are the cows? Did something happen to the cows? He didn't understand. They go from they go over the hill into another pasture. Sometimes they move them around and all of that. The feeding zone is somewhere else, perhaps, and all of that. So in a more urban setting, if you lived in a city all the time, you would lose sight of sometimes the demand that this place is on, and how hard this is to be in an agricultural culture, an agricultural environment. And when the Israelites are taken into Babylonian captivity, they're there to work, and they're to work the fields and the herds of the Babylonians. And when it's time to harvest or it's time to plant in the farming culture, you do it. You don't look at what day of the week it is. And there are, I'm sure, farmers in this area that when it's Sunday morning, or if they're SDA on Saturday morning, it's time to go to church, they get up and go to church no matter what, no matter what's going on in the crops, no matter what's going on with the weather. But there's also farmers that may go to church faithfully the rest of the year, but if it's planting time or harvest time, they're busting it the whole time. They're working really hard 7 days a week. They don't take a day off because it's church day or Sabbath day or anything like that. They've got work to do. And God is telling Israel, you keep Sabbath no matter what. This predates, in the context of the narrative, predates the law itself. They haven't entered into the covenant technically yet. They haven't agreed to abide by the standards, by the statutes God gives them. This is like one of the first things you have to do. And it's tied in to the gathering of manna. And I think that points out that when you're trying to keep the law, it's really important to keep all of the law. You're kind of in for a penny, you're in for a pound. It's really hard to pick and choose. And say, I'll do this, but I won't do that. I'll keep the Sabbath, but I'm not going to gather twice on double on Friday. How does that work out for you? Yeah. Yeah. So it's, and then when Paul talks about, trying to keep parts of the law and not keeping other parts of the law, and the real struggle that Paul takes on, the heart of the struggle of Paul and the message of Paul is blending Jewish and Gentile cultures in the early church, Jewish and primarily Greco-Roman cultures in the early church. And they had to, but it wasn't just Paul. It was a big, the Council of Jerusalem. I'll talk about that some other day when y'all don't have, nobody in here is concealed carrying or anything like that. I know that no one is, because it's going to make you mad probably. But that reflects an attempt to blend Jewish and Gentile culture. Because the Jews were looking at how the Gentiles lived, in particular how they ate. And said, you can't do that. One of the most famous restaurants, and the oldest restaurant that's continually running in the world, is in Paris. It's called La Tour d'Argent. I've never been to Paris. I've never been to the restaurant. I don't know if when Sherry and I go there, I don't know if we'll be in a big hurry to go there or not. I'm sure it's very expensive. But their signature dish is smothered duck cooked in its own blood. There's a whole lot of things wrong with that in terms of the Mosaic diet. You cannot eat things that were strangled, smothered, and then you can't have the blood. But that's their signature dish. Thought of y'all don't even like duck. You might like it like that if I've had people get really mad at me for some of this stuff. Some of the best food I've ever had was at my brother and his wife's wedding reception in Lake Charles, Louisiana, because the ladies of the congregation all brought homemade Cajun food down there. And if you want me to try to guess what was in all that Cajun food, forget it. And if you don't think they put pig blood in some of their sausage and things like that, they do. And it's delicious. And you might think I wouldn't eat that. As you're eating that sausage, I would never eat blood. This boudin noir is good. That a lot of the stuff about the law, and the Sabbath includes this, is about leaving meat on the bone, in a sense. About leaving money on the table. About shearing a sheep rather than skinning it. It's just a lot about sustainability. This is why you rotate crops. You don't farm the same land every single year with the exact same crop. You give a year, the land gets a year of Sabbath. They get a year off. It gets a year off. And you have to leave something back for the Lord. You leave, in a sense, unclean animals. There's a lot of things going on there, but you're saying to the world, we don't have to eat these unclean animals because God's going to give us, because we're his faithful people in faithful obedience. And that's kind of redundant almost. The faithfulness is seen in the obedience. God is going to give us all the clean animals we need. We don't have to work on the Sabbath because God is going to make us prosperous working 6 days a week. Yes, ma'am.
Well, there was a whole lot of animals left with Egypt, with them goats and cows and sheep and chickens and everything. What do you do on the Sabbath? Does the Lord not make them produce enough?
And what do you do now on the Sabbath?
Yeah.
Because the animals that we have now have been so manipulated over the centuries. There's not cows now. There are actually hybrid cows or whatever. But when you breed cows to do one thing, a lot of times they're not particularly good at anything else, but they do that one thing maybe better than you want it to. A Holstein, I got a farm boy here, correct me, but a Holstein cow can produce about 75 pounds of milk a day. That's a lot of milk.
And
You don't milk it.
If you don't milk it, what do you-
It's not good for the cow, is it?
Not good, no.
Yeah. That's why for a small farm, y'all may have had a milk cow, but you probably didn't have a Holstein as your milk cow.
No,
A
we
Jersey
just
or a
had
Guernsey or
one of
something.
the milk cows we had a Guernsey.
Guernsey,
Jersey.
smaller quantity, but very rich milk.
Right.
And that's
Hard to milk.
how my mother, they lived out in the middle of nowhere in western Arkansas, and they had a milk cow, and it was either a Jersey or Guernsey. They never had a Holstein. They had Herefords and hybrids kind of out that they would raise for beef, but their milk cow was a small, those Jersey and Guernseys are both pretty small, and maybe not the friendliest cows in the world. My grandma could milk them no problem. My pawpaw, him and that cow would go to war whenever it was his turn to milk. I mean, and he'd lose. And, you know, so. But, you know, Mark's going to cry himself to sleep tonight. But, but that's the Sabbath is not to be observed in isolation from everything else. The kosher diet isn't really, and I say kosher because that's kind of our term now, but the Mosaic diet isn't to be observed isn't intended to be observed in the midst of people who do not keep that diet. It is incredibly difficult to keep the Mosaic diet, the kosher diet, to keep really kosher strictly in America today. It is almost impossible. The next time you go buy lunch meat, you look in the ingredients of that lunch meat and see if the word lactate isn't in there. There is some kind of milk solid in that meat. And you're not supposed to have milk with meat. The law says you're not supposed to boil the kid in its own mother's milk. But does that strictly mean that's all you do is you don't boil baby goats in their mother's milk? Or does that mean, is the meaning of that bigger than that? But then how big is it? So this is when Paul particularly talks about nobody keeping the law perfectly. I mean, it is impossible to keep the law other than Christ. And Christ, his disciples, they pick grain on the Sabbath. David goes and eats the consecrated bread and gives it to his men. David's the chosen king of God, but his men, they're just his men. So this is an important concept. It's absolutely vital to the identity of who the Jewish people are. And they are to keep it. And when they don't keep it, and they don't keep the laws around it, it gets really hard to keep. And if they don't keep it, there's big problems for them. But then we also see at times where they can obey strictly the religious laws that are expected of them, but then they've lost kind of the daily life laws. They don't treat each other right. And that's Isaiah chapter 1. You keep all the Sabbaths, you do all this, but you don't plead the case for the poor. You don't protect the widows and the orphans. You don't welcome the strangers. You don't live a life that reflects God's intentions for daily life for human beings. And you think you can basically come to church on Sunday or Saturday and it all, because your worship is technically acceptable, it cannot possibly be acceptable from you, is what Isaiah is telling the Israelites. You cannot offer acceptable worship, even if it's technically correct, because of who you are and how you're living the rest of the time. There's no chance for you to offer acceptable and pleasing worship to God. We can't go out, and murder our neighbors on Saturday, unrepentantly show up on Sunday morning and, well, we didn't have a piano, so our church must have been good. Our worship must have been good this week. It's not the way it works. It was never the way it works. Technical obedience does not trump living a life that is in keeping with the attributes of God that he wants to see in his people. And yet you are supposed to obey. God is giving this to them for their benefit, to honor them and to delineate them and say, these are my people. These are the people who follow a God that created the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh. If you go back and you look at the story of creation in Genesis, it's really the first chapter and a little bit into the second chapter. It's really very visually evocative, to see. You can kind of imagine what was going on during all that. And each day, really big, significant things happen. But none of those things are consecrated. None of those things make that day holy. In a sense, those days are profane. Those days are common days. Those are days you work with earthly things. It is a day in which God doesn't create anything. That is the day that is sacred. That is the day that is consecrated and made holy. Every seventh day for Israel was Labor Day, in a sense. They rested from their labors. When I was a kid one year, probably more than 1 year, I was a McDonald's crew kid, and I had to work on Labor Day. And I thought, that's just terrible, isn't it? Making somebody flip burgers on Labor Day. But that's, we even wrote me and another guy, wrote a little song called Working on Labor Day. So I think it would have been a good country western song. But it never took flight. So, but this is very much about trusting in God for the provision of our needs. This is about keeping the Sabbath reflects confidence in God. Keeping the diet will reflect confidence in God. Not over gathering the manna reflects confidence in God. Gathering as you're supposed to, the double on the right day, reflects a desire to obey God. Reflects confidence or trust in the fact that God's not going to put the bread out there the next day. So this is all about, he is instituting the need and the importance of obedience to them, because they're going to be facing great trials up ahead. And if they don't trust God, they don't trust the leadership Moses gives them, they have no chance. And ultimately, they don't trust God, and they don't trust the leadership Moses has, and they die in the wilderness. But God has given them a way to live. Any other thoughts on that or anything else in chapter 16? And we'll get started in chapter 17.
Well, along with what you were saying earlier, Paul talked about a lot of things that you do, and if you do them without love, there is no point. It's like a song or a plain symbol.
Okay.
They did this, it says for 40 years. That would be a long time to have the same meal. But provided it shows the provision that God made for his people also. He didn't just put them out there and let them die. They basically lived their lives out there because of their problems beforehand. Most of them didn't enter, including Moses and Aaron, didn't enter the promised land.
Well, it created a tough act to follow.
Oh, yeah.
And we talked to Bill about this last week, that when Jesus fed the multitudes, their response is, Moses fed us for 40 years in the wilderness. You got us one meal. Yeah, you made it out of a kid's sack lunch or whatever, but it's they're fine with God feeding them. They're used to God feeding them. That's part of who they are. So it's that's how big a deal this is, I think. Yes, sir.
Not everybody did it for 40 years.
Well, the nation did it as for 40 years.
Yeah.
The nation did it, and that's the point. This is to sustain them while they're in the wilderness, which wasn't supposed to be for 40 years. But God's provision is such, even when they sin, and that means they're going to be in the wilderness for 40 years, God's provision takes care of them. Even when Cain sins and kills Abel, God's provision is, you will live. No one will kill you, Cain. I put this mark on you, not to punish you, but to keep other people from punishing you, to make a provision for you so you will live. It won't be maybe the life you want to live, but you will live. And they don't want to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and God didn't want them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But that's what happens. And God's provision is more than adequate for that. When as a church, not just this congregation, but a lot of groups will have a special event where they feed people. We do our holiday baskets at the end of the year. And a lot of other groups do things around the holidays or have a special event, maybe even once a week. They'll have a kitchen open or something like that, come in Tuesday afternoons, free lunch and all that. And that's a wonderful work. I'm not knocking that work at all. But if people only eat once a week, that's going to be a rough week, isn't it? So it just shows that our attempts to be like God, I guess, to be godly people, maybe a better way of putting that, to be godly people, are pretty feeble in comparison to what God actually does. We have, maybe we won't get in chapter 17, but around here we have a lot of irrigated farmland. And I don't know if they've got any other way of irrigating. I think all I've seen is those center pivots. Do they have other irrigation methods in use out here?
It's usually overhead irrigation. There's some rail irrigation where
Okay.
they run it down rows and whatnot.
Okay.
But a lot of it around this area is basically overhead pivots or in line.
Okay. And that costs a lot of money. The equipment's expensive. The fuel to run the pumps and all that is expensive. And
it's just like everything else. Every day is a little more.
It's a little more. And they put out the water. They can control it at least. They can usually, as long as they got enough water to put into it from the rivers and everything. How long does it cost God, or how long does it take God to water a field when He wants to water it?
About 5 minutes.
Yeah. How much does it cost?
Well, depends on where it goes.
That's how you know how unnatural golf courses are compared to farming, because farmers almost always will take rain in the summertime. There's a lot of golf courses out there. They don't want it to rain at all in the summer because they can control precisely how much water they put on it if it does not rain. When it rains, they could get too much water on there. So golf is pretty unnatural when you think about it. It's pretty. The courses are pretty a lot of times, but they're not natural. But a lot of, that's our attempts to be like God are always going to pale to insignificance compared to God. Our attempts to feed the hungry are nothing compared to how God can do when it comes to feeding the hungry. And when God wants to feed the hungry, He can feed a nation that doesn't even have borders, that's not planting crops. A nation that doesn't have crops under till is eating bread every day. He's not bound. He is a God without borders, without earthly borders. The borders of God's kingdom on earth are in the hearts of His people. Where His people are lacking, that's not where His will is being done, at least not yet. So Sabbath really touches the whole of the law of Moses that we haven't even gotten into yet. It is kind of, in a sense, the ultimate test of trusting God. To not work. And it pushes back. It pushes back against the kind of the Protestant work ethic that's so prominent in America. It pushes back against this veneration of work, that it's such a wonderful thing to work so very hard. Throughout human history, everybody worked hard. There was no way to not work hard. You didn't work hard except for maybe the king, and everybody else worked really hard. That's just the way it was. But the work, yes, Adam and Eve had work to do in the garden, but earning your living by the sweat of your brow is part of the curse, right? God is not calling upon Israel to celebrate Him in their work, in a sense. He does, in a way. But in the Sabbath, it's in their rest that they're honoring what God does for them or has done for them. And then also showing that they hope He will continue to do it. That omer of bread that they keep, an omer of manna that they keep, is a reminder God fed us before. God, in a real sense, is still feeding us today. If we don't see that, that's just because we're selfish. But everything you've got in your pantry, everything you got in your fridge, everything you've got, maybe you've got a roast in the oven right now, you're just heating up your house. I don't know why you do that. But, this is the time of year for salads.
Go to the garden and get the veggies.
So, the point of being a faithful child of God is not technically obeying lists. The point of being a faithful, obedient child of God is to live your life in full confidence and trust that God will keep his promises. And we can do that today. And when we have a difficult decision, maybe a difficult ethical question to answer, we can ask ourselves, what reflects trust in God more? What does a better job of showing that I believe God is going to keep his promises? And that can mix things up a little bit. So. Okay. We didn't get into 17. It's a short chapter. I bet we knock it all out next week, and we'll do it then. So thank you for your attention and your comments. Mr. Hensley, will you lead us in a closing prayer, please?